This is Chapter 5, U.S. LGBTQ History. So, the norms in colonial America through the Civil War is what the chapter starts out with. So first we have to talk about white settler colonial norms. So colonial Europeans established norms of marital reproduction and a sexual double standard within gender roles. Nearly 600 indigenous tribes constructed gender differently and allowed for varied sexual practices, which challenged European beliefs that God created two fixed genders that corresponded to different roles, and that sex was only for reproduction. Any sex act that did not result in babies was considered sinful. Colonizers' descriptions of what we now call two-spirit people were forced into Western understandings as white settlers gained power through murder, but also through labeling indigenous genders as sinful, criminal, and subject to punishment. Consolidation of English power resulted in writing white supremacy into the law, outlawing interracial relationships, and allowing slaveholders to legally rape without consequences. An example of how gender was understood was demonstrated by the case of Thomasine Hall, discussed in the chapter, that was deemed controversial for taking on both men's clothes and men's roles, and then later women's clothes and women's roles, resulting in examinations of Hall's body, to the point where the governor ruled that Thomasine was both male and female, and needed to wear clothing from both sexes so everyone would know that they were different. This case gives us some insight into colonial norms and values of gender at that time. So gender, racial, and class hierarchies established in the 18th century helped shape the 20th century. So from the American Revolution through the Civil War, defining sex acts rather than identities continued. New gender norms affected attitudes towards same-gender attraction. In the late 1700s, society idealized women as passionless, less lustful, and more spiritually moral than men, that is, Protestant middle-class women, while it was believed that men struggled to control their sex drives. So this idea that women and men differed in desire facilitated widespread acceptance of emotionally intense same-gender relationships alongside traditional marriage. Industrialization through the 1800s played many important roles in forming communities by sexual orientation. As people moved to cities, communities based on same-sex attraction were formed. By the late 1800s, New York developed a subculture of identity terms like fairy to refer to effeminate working-class men, and the term queer for gender-normative men who loved men. But then we have sexology, and this pathologized identity. So European sexology repackaged marital production norms on sin into the language of medical science, which allowed their bias to inform the discipline. It is in this research that we first get the terms heterosexual and homosexual. Most sexologists argued that same-sex attraction connected to gender transgression was a pathology or disease. So queer communities continued to spread, and society's acceptance of romantic friendships declined. And anti-vice campaigns rose by the 1920s that punished queer expression. After Prohibition ended, federal and state officials enacted alcoholic beverage laws to police respectability in bars and gave the authority to revoke licenses if bar owners allowed the presence of quote-unquote undesirables, such as prostitutes, gamblers, gays, or lesbians, which meant it was common to raid bars on suspicions of homosexuality. During World War II, the military spread the normalization of heterosexuality and the negative view of homosexuality as psychologists convinced military leaders that homosexuality was a mental disorder that threatened morale and discipline. Men were questioned before their service, being excluded if they were suspected to be gay. 18 million men were questioned, which elevated the recognition that homosexuality existed while also pathologizing it, right? Creating it as a disease. Officials feared that people would pretend to be gay to avoid going to war, so they labeled those who were rejected as sexual psychopaths and gave employers the right to review draft records. Gay service members caught or suspected faced humiliating expulsion with undesirable discharges, so gay and lesbian communities really still did thrive and continued to grow in spite of this kind of repression. By the Cold War, new laws targeted homosexuals, including a presidential order signed by Eisenhower that would not allow homosexuals to hold federal jobs. The 1950s Red Scare also victimized gays and lesbians. So in the face of McCarthyism LGBTQ communities further institutionalized and began organizing a homophile movement for civil rights. And this was influenced by experiences of the 1950s Red Scare, as they structured the groups into secret cells to avoid government infiltration. Founders blended Marxist theory that injustice and oppression were deeply embedded in societal structures and argued that repressive norms based in heterosexuality left homosexuals largely unaware that they were a social minority that was being imprisoned within the dominant culture. So they mobilized to produce a pride of belonging to the homosexual minority. When new leadership took over the Mattachine Society and other groups, the movement's focus on white, middle-class gay members, they argued that they were the same as heterosexuals in all ways except for one. So they tried to get psychologists, clergy, and public officials on their side and had much more of a mainstream assimilationist focus. So another really important turning point is the Compton's Cafeteria riot. So in 1966, 3 years before Stonewall, a group of trans women in San Francisco stood up to police inside Gene Compton's Cafeteria, an all-night restaurant and popular queer gathering spot. A trans woman fed up with the harassment and abuse is said to have thrown a cup of coffee in an officer's face, sparking a chaotic riot, an unprecedented moment of trans resistance to police violence. Although the protest did not end abuse, collective militant queer resistance pushed the city to address their rights as citizens. 3 years later, the Stonewall Riot on June 28, 1969, trans and lesbian patrons resisted police harassment, refusing to be groped or show identification to police officers. A crowd outside the bar formed, trapping the cops in the bar, and when reinforcements arrived, the crowds outside clashed with police. Rioting resumed the next night and the night after that. So this did not stop police raids, but it spurred the creation of the Gay Liberation Front, which sought to combine freedom from homophobia with a broader political platform that denounced racism and opposed capitalism. Activists like Carl Whitman argued that gay men must discard male chauvinism as anti-gay and reject gender roles and marriage to embrace queens as gutsy for standing out. This paralleled the rise of lesbian feminism that wanted women to have autonomy instead of being someone's mother, daughter, sister, or wife. More movements grew, even within religious communities, to support gays and reject homophobia. While on the other hand, fundamentalist evangelicals became increasingly vocal in condemning homosexuals and gender nonconforming people, beginning of what some call the culture wars. So gays held demonstrations against the APA, which had listed homosexuality as a mental disorder in its DSM. In 1973, the DSM removed homosexuality, but gender identity disorders remained. It was an important step, though, removing homosexuality from the DSM in discrediting conversion therapy, or an often torturous process where people try to change someone's sexual orientation by making them associate same-sex relations with nausea or pain. So in the 1970s, we saw lesbian and gay politicians begin to be elected. But we also saw the backlashes as well, such as Anita Bryant and her campaign to overturn Florida's gay rights ordinance of 1977, which sparked a fight between conservative Christians that were against equal rights and gay activists and their allies that were in support of equal rights regardless of sexual orientation. Not surprisingly, cities with anti-gay campaigns experienced increased violence against gays, lesbians, and their homes, their businesses, their community centers, their churches. And this culminated in the murder of Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone in San Francisco by former Board of Supervisors member and former cop Dan White, who received only 5 years for manslaughter for murdering the pair. By the end of the 1970s, activists successfully decriminalized sodomy statutes and convinced the Democrats to include a plank against sexual orientation-based discrimination within its 1980 platform. It took until 2003 before those laws were gone nationwide. So more people came out, in spite of the hazards of rejection from their families, violence, and legal discrimination. Also during this time period, it's important to note that Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson started STAR, which was an organization that was the first homeless queer youth and sex worker shelter in North America. They recognized the links between homophobia, transphobia, racism, and classism. So for more great information about these groups, watch the quick video narrated by Billy Porter in the chapter. When AIDS arrived, it came with a 100% mortality rate, and this caused panic. In 1981, the first cases were seen, and there was a link to gay male sexuality, which provided a new justification for harassment and discriminatory laws as the power of the radical Christian right continued to ascend, especially with the election of President Reagan. In response to AIDS, LGBTQ Americans organized new institutions and created new methods to get much-needed resources. The healthcare system failed. They failed to address the epidemic's causes or consequences. So in New York City, gay men formed the Gay Men's Health Crisis in 1982, which became a model for AIDS service organizations and offered support and information to prevent and treat AIDS. A major contributor to the AIDS epidemic was the willful neglect from the federal government. The first 5 years of the epidemic, President Reagan never mentioned it, and in 1986, he proposed cutting government spending on AIDS. So many attribute this lack of response to the fact that people associated AIDS with gay communities and IV drug users, right? Wrongfully acting as if this disease could not affect people outside of that scope, but because those were two very marginalized groups in society, there was not widespread action. A lot of people felt that they were just being left to die. So in response, the group ACT UP formed, with the slogan, "Silence equals death." They disrupted Wall Street, they protested the FDA, the CDC, St. Patrick's Cathedral, and their chapters spread throughout the country, reclaiming the word queer, as Keith Haring's art helped spread the message. LGBTQ Americans organized, formed groups, marched on Washington, and new trans groups arose as well to address poverty and job discrimination. Budget cuts to AIDS programs, welfare, and health programs were devastating, while for-profit centers charged gender transition procedures at very expensive costs. Gays, lesbians, and bisexual Americans who shared other minority statuses started gathering in the 1970s and 80s, such as those who were deaf, indigenous, African American, interracial, or other peoples of color. They criticized white domination of queer communities. By the 90s and 2000s, new drug therapies prolonged the lives of people living with AIDS. The activism of the time was dominated by achieving mainstream legal protections, such as inclusion in the military, anti-discrimination laws, and marriage equality. Violence continued, as illustrated by the horrific murders of Brandon Teena and Matthew Shepard. Queer Nation formed and used direct actions that were defiantly queer to liberate sexuality and gender from heteronormativity. Hate crimes legislation, which we'll discuss more in Chapter 6, added gay bashing as a hate crime. Conservatives lamented this gradually increasing acceptance of LGBT people as celebrity musicians and TV stars started coming out. National LGBT organizations pushed to extend marriage equality nationwide after Hawaii temporarily legalized same-sex marriage in 1996, though it took until 2015 before same-sex couples gained the right to marry at the federal level in all 50 states. We'll explore more the legal side of these changes within Chapter 6.